In a powerful southern kingdom, where palaces gleamed with white stone and the court was accustomed to welcoming guests with music and gifts of gold, an unusual traveler appeared one day. He was a young prince from a distant northern kingdom. He had come to ask for the hand of the king's daughter, but arrived without a magnificent retinue, without banners, and without a caravan of jewels. Only one faithful squire rode beside him, while the prince himself wore a simple traveling cloak, covered in dust from the long road. He had no intention of impressing the southern court with wealth. The prince wanted to speak to the king directly and openly, offering an alliance between the two kingdoms, based not on advantage and vanity, but on mutual respect. He brought with him no chests of gold, only his word of honor and the forthrightness of the northern wind. The next day, the young prince went for a walk in the palace gardens, wishing to rest a while from the ceremonies and the curious glances of the courtiers. In their most distant corner, where the old paths were overgrown with grass and the stone wall had darkened with age, he unexpectedly saw the princess. She stood beside ancient rose bushes with a grey-haired gardener. She wore simple gloves. The hem of her dress was slightly soiled with earth, and several loose strands of hair fell across her face. The princess was carefully tying up a weak branch and asking the gardener how the roses planted by her great-grandmother had survived the winter. She listened attentively to the old man and answered him with such warmth that he might have been not a servant, but an old friend. The prince stopped without meaning to. He had expected to see a fragile flower in a vase, but instead found a skillful gardener tending the roots of her lineage. The prince did not approach at once, so as not to disturb their work. When the princess straightened, he asked quietly, "Why are these roses so dear to you?" She was surprised. Guests usually asked which variety was the most beautiful, or how old the bushes were. But now she told him that her great-grandmother had planted them in the year of the great drought, and carried water to them herself from the old well. Ever since, the women of her family had guarded the roses as a remembrance of patience and devotion. Then the princess asked, "What are the winters like in the north?" He told her of the snow that lingered for months, of crackling logs, and of the tales people listened to by the hearth, while the wind knocked against the shutters. He did not boast or try to please her. He spoke to her simply, as an equal, and listened carefully to every answer. And in that quiet conversation about old roses and long winters, they learned more about each other than they had from all the ambassadors' reports. When their conversation ended, neither of them wished to return to the palace at once. They both felt that something important had happened among the old roses, though they did not yet know how to name the feeling. The prince suddenly understood that before him stood not merely the daughter of a powerful king, but someone who felt just as confined within the golden cage of duty. From birth, others had chosen their paths, their obligations, and even their future spouses for them. For the first time, the princess had met someone who did not regard her as a prize, did not try to win her favor, and demanded nothing of her. He had seen her true self. What arose between them was not ardent love at first sight, but a quiet recognition. They were the children of two kings, but on that day, for the first time, they felt like simply two people who could be themselves in each other's company. The king did not remain unaware for long. He was used to noticing the slightest changes at his court, and soon saw how his daughter searched for the northern prince with her eyes, how much calmer she became beside him, and how rarely she now spoke of other suitors. This alarmed him more than open defiance would have done. The prince himself did not inspire distrust. The king could see his honesty and dignity. Yet that was precisely why the danger seemed more serious. He feared giving his beloved daughter to a distant northern land, and feared even more losing the right to determine her destiny. For the future of the kingdom, he had long planned another, more advantageous alliance. And now, looking at the quiet smiles of the young couple, the king saw not the birth of love, but the collapse of his own carefully constructed plans. An alliance founded upon feelings alone seemed far too unpredictable to him. The next morning, the king ordered the northern prince summoned to the throne room and received him with conspicuous favor. "You ask for my daughter's hand and an alliance with my land," he said. "But first prove that you can be of use to her, not as a prince, but as a man. Show that you value labor and the land." And the king appointed 3 trials. In a single day, the prince was to clear the stones from an old field that had lain abandoned for many years. Then he was to restore a ruined mountain channel and carry water through it to a withered garden. After that, by sunset of the following day, he was to harvest an enormous field of wheat without losing a single sheaf. The courtiers were silent. Everyone understood that no one man could accomplish such a thing. But the king smiled. He offered the prince not a battle of swords, but a battle against stone, earth, and time. The first trial was an abandoned plot in the royal forest. The earth there had almost vanished beneath ancient boulders, covered with moss, and embedded so deeply in the soil that the mountain itself seemed to hold them by their roots. The prince had to remove the stones and turn the wasteland into farmland. The second trial was the old road to a distant mill and several villages. Rain had washed it away, ravines cut across the slope, and landslides had blocked the passage with heavy clay and tree trunks. It had to be made passable for carts once more. But the third task seemed the most hopeless. At the foot of the mountains lay a stony field that had yielded no crop for many years. The soil had hardened almost to rock, and the prince was to prepare it for sowing. Each of these labours would have required hundreds of people and many months of work. The king had set 3 silent enemies before him: stone, mud, and barrenness. The prince listened to the king until the end and immediately understood his design. These trials were not a test, but a mockery devised to make him abandon his intentions and leave the court in humiliation. For a moment, the pride of a northern warrior spoke within him. He wanted to bow, turn away, and never return. But at the doors of the hall, he saw the princess. She stood in silence, looking at him with anxiety and hope. Then the prince lowered his gaze, as if laying his own pride at the king's feet, and bowed deeply. "I accept your conditions, Your Majesty. I am prepared to labour and prove that I am worthy of your daughter's hand." And in that moment, he performed his first true act of courage. He agreed to exchange his sword for a shovel for the sake of the woman he loved. The next day, the prince put on simple working clothes and went to the stony field. Hundreds of heavy boulders lay before him, and for the first time in many years, he did not know what to do. A sword could not clear a single furrow here, and the strength of one man was clearly not enough. At night, when the palace had fallen silent, the princess came to him in secret. "I saw that you accepted the challenge," she said. "It was noble, but you cannot succeed alone. My father underestimated not only you, but me as well. I will help you." She had not come as a magical fairy, nor did she promise to accomplish the impossible in a single night. She brought plans of the old lands, knowledge of the people, and the locations where the necessary tools could be found. That night, the prince understood that beside him stood not a rescuer, but a true ally. The prince looked at her hopefully, and the princess began at once to speak with such calm precision that it seemed she had long considered every one of the trials. "You cannot manage the boulders alone, but the finest stonecutters in the kingdom live in a northern mountain village. I will send word to them, and they will help." She pointed to the stony field. "It appears dead, but I know families of farmers whose land my father once took away. Promise them a share of the future harvest, and they themselves will wish to bring this soil back to life." Then the princess turned toward the forest. And the road is not completely destroyed. Beneath the mud, roots, and moss lies the old stonework built in my grandfather's time. It need not be constructed anew, only cleared. She knew her land not from palace maps, but from the stories of old people, from its villages, and from the paths she had walked herself. And this knowledge proved more valuable than an entire army. Encouraged by the princess's words, the prince set to work at dawn. Meanwhile, she secretly sent trusted servants to the mountain village, to the stone cutters, and to the families of farmers who could be trusted. Within a few days, dozens of people were already working upon the forgotten land. The prince labored alongside everyone else. He carried stones, swung a pickaxe, helped harness the horses, and demanded no special task for himself. The princess did not remain in the palace either. She brought the workers water and bread, helped stack the smaller stones, and watched carefully to ensure that no one worked beyond their strength. The work gathered momentum. Everyone did what they knew best, and every day the palace spies reported everything to the king. He listened in silence and frowned. His carefully designed plan was beginning to collapse. Day after day, the prince and princess labored side by side, and their former quiet affection imperceptibly grew into something far greater. The prince saw how she spoke with the farmers, carried water to tired workers, and gathered stones from the road with her own hands, fearing neither dust nor blisters. Before him stood no longer merely a beautiful princess, but a strong woman upon whom he could rely. And she saw how he took up the pickaxe at dawn, worked as hard as everyone else, and never retreated from his given word. They needed no lengthy declarations. Sometimes a brief glance across the field or a weary smile at the end of the day was enough. Their love was born not to the music of a ball, but amid stones, dust, and difficult labor. That was why its foundation was the most enduring feeling of all: profound respect for one another. Several weeks passed, and what had seemed impossible was completed. The abandoned forest plot had been cleared of its ancient boulders, and the dark earth already awaited the first seeds. The old road to the mill was level and wide once more, and carts of grain passed over it with ease. At the foot of the mountains, the stony field had been ploughed, fertilized, and sown. Then the prince washed the dust of the road from his hands, put on a modest court doublet, and presented himself to the king. He did not speak of the difficulties or list his achievements. He merely bowed calmly and said, "Your Majesty, I have fulfilled your conditions. Now I ask for the promised reward, your daughter's hand." He came without a sword, but the calluses on his palms spoke more persuasively than any weapon. The king was astonished. He had not believed that the northern prince could complete even one trial. And now he saw before him a man who had kept his word. Something else was even more troubling. During the work, the princess and her chosen one had become nearly inseparable. But the king did not dare openly break his promise. "Well, you have proved your diligence," he said with a gracious smile. "A wedding, however, is not a matter to be rushed. Guests must be summoned, feasts prepared, and every custom observed. From that day onward, endless delays began. At times, the king arranged festivities lasting several days in honor of the completed work. At others, he suddenly invited the prince on a distant hunt, or announced that the ambassadors had not yet had time to arrive. He tried to drown his given word in celebrations and postponements, hoping the prince would one day tire of waiting and leave of his own accord. The prince waited patiently for several more days, but soon understood that the king had no intention of keeping his promise. Then he went to the king himself and said calmly, without threats, "If there is to be no wedding, Your Majesty, I will leave your court and return to the north." This time, the king did not smile. "You are not going anywhere," he replied sharply. "You may remain my honored guest for as long as you wish, but you will not have my daughter." That same evening, the guards at the palace gates were doubled. They were ordered to be impeccably polite, but not to allow the prince beyond the walls. Thus the man, who had arrived with an open word, became a prisoner of another man's fear. Hospitality turned into a prison, and rich chambers into a golden cage. Now the prince understood that he could wait no longer. When the princess learned that the gates had been closed to the northern prince, she saw her father's decision for the first time, without her former excuses. He intended neither to keep his word nor to let them go. If they remained, there would be guards today, another trial tomorrow, and then another obstacle more cruel still. She sat for a long time at the window of her room. It pained her to think of her father. She loved him and understood his fear. But now she saw clearly that love which deprived another person of choice became a form of power. And then something changed within her. She no longer wished to wait for someone else to decide where and with whom she would live. The princess decided to leave. This was not the flight of a frightened daughter from her home. It was her own choice and her own responsibility. She understood that it was better to meet the unknown as a free woman than to remain a prisoner, even in the most beautiful palace. Deep in the night, the princess quietly entered the prince's chambers. He sat beside the dead fireplace, gloomy and tired, not knowing how much longer his honorable captivity would last. "We are leaving tonight," she said. "I have decided." She had brought a small traveling bag with bread, dried fruit, and water, as well as a warm cloak for the road. Then she took out a small carved box and opened it. Upon dark velvet lay 3 ordinary walnuts. "This is my mother's parting gift," the princess whispered. "She told me to open them only in a moment of the greatest, truest need. Each one holds what I will require then." She closed the box and held it out to the prince. "You keep it safe." He accepted the gift carefully, as though he held not 3 nuts, but 3 miracles still asleep. The palace slept as the prince and princess quietly went out into the garden. They did not seek secret underground passages or call servants to their aid. Passing between the dark rose bushes, they reached a low stone wall, climbed over it, and for the first time found themselves together on the other side of the palace walls. Ahead, the old mill road gleamed silver beneath the moon. Only recently, it had been one of the king's trials, broken, overgrown, and nearly forgotten. But now the stones lay evenly. The ruts had been cleared, and the road passed peacefully between the hills. They walked along it side by side, and every stone beneath their feet seemed to recognize them, because they themselves had restored this road to life. What had been a trial was now becoming a path to freedom and to a new destiny of their own choosing. The journey to the Northern Kingdom was long, but neither of them wished to hurry it. By day, they rode through green fields, quiet villages, and cool forests, speaking of everything the palace walls had never allowed them to discuss. In the evenings, they lit a small fire, shared a simple supper, and sat for a long time beneath the stars, listening to the rustle of the grass and the night birds. For the first time, there were no orders above them, no rules of court, and no decisions made by others. They belonged only to themselves and to each other. It seemed to them that every trial was already behind them, while ahead waited a home, a wedding, and a peaceful life. They were exiles without crowns or retinues. Yet they had never felt so free and happy. At last, the borders of the Northern Kingdom appeared ahead, and beyond the green hills rose the familiar spires of the prince's ancestral castle. He stopped his horse and turned to his companion with a smile. "My beloved, I cannot bring you into my home as an ordinary wanderer. You are a princess and must enter it as my future queen." He asked her to wait in a small village near the old castle mill. "I will speak to my mother first, prepare a worthy welcome, and send a carriage and retinue for you. In a few hours, we will enter the castle together." The princess agreed, seeing no reason for concern. He rode away joyfully, certain they would soon meet again, unaware that this brief separation would become the beginning of the longest and bitterest trial of their lives. The Dowager Queen met her son at the very doors of the castle. Seeing him after their long separation, she forgot the courtiers, embraced him tightly, and wept with happiness. But as soon as the prince began to speak of his companion, her expression changed. He spoke of the princess with a warmth his mother had never before heard in his voice. He told of her intelligence and courage, of how she had shared his hardships and left her home for his sake. The queen listened and understood that the person before her was no longer the young man she had once sent on his journey. He had returned as an adult, capable of choosing his own fate. Her heart rejoiced at his happiness. But beside that joy grew an anxious fear. She was no longer the only woman whose word determined his life. The prince continued his story, failing to notice the change in his mother's face. He spoke of his bride's wisdom, of her kindness, of how she had helped him with the difficult labor and left her home together with him. "I gave her my word," he said at last, "and I wish to keep it." The warmer his voice became, the colder the queen's gaze grew. For many years, she had been her son's foremost counselor, his closest companion, the person whose opinion he heeded before all others. Now some foreign girl, whom she had never even seen or chosen, was to take that place. The queen feared more than the loss of influence. Deep in her heart, she dreaded loneliness. But she could not admit this to herself. "He is blinded," she decided. "I must save him." Thus a mother's love imperceptibly transformed into a desire to hold on to her son at any cost. Having resolved to act, the queen hid her unease behind an affectionate smile. She listened to her son until the end, then appeared to yield. "Very well, my son," she said gently. "I see that your decision is firm. I bless your choice. Come to me, and let me embrace you and kiss you for good fortune." The prince smiled with relief and approached his mother. She held him tightly and kissed his cheek. But this kiss was no simple maternal farewell. Within it lived the old, almost forgotten magic of their bloodline. Long ago, the women of the royal family had used it, as they said, to protect their sons from mistaken decisions and keep them near. It was a spell of forgetting, and the kiss that promised a blessing became a seal erasing from the prince's memory the woman for whom he had travelled so far. After his mother's kiss, the prince suddenly felt slightly dizzy, as though he had just awakened from a sleep that had lasted too long. He blinked, passed a hand over his face, and at that moment, the veil of forgetting descended upon his mind. Everything vanished. The southern kingdom, the old roses, the stony fields, the difficult labor, the flight by night, and the woman for whom he had left his former life behind. The most important year was torn from his memory like a page from the book. The prince remembered only that he had wandered through the world for a long time, grown weary, and finally returned home. "I am so glad to be home, Mother," he said quietly. "It seems I was away somewhere for a very long time." The queen smiled and embraced her son again. Triumph flashed in her eyes. She had achieved her aim. The past had disappeared, and her son, as she believed, belonged only to her once more. Meanwhile, the princess waited at the old mill. 1 hour passed, then another, but still no one appeared on the road leading to the castle. By evening, the sky had darkened, and the first stars lit up above the hills. She tried not to worry. They must be preparing a ceremonial welcome at the palace, the princess thought, assembling the retinue and harnessing the horses. But the whole night passed. At dawn, she rose from the bench and peered down the empty road. Neither a carriage nor a familiar rider could be seen. She could not believe that the prince would break his word or forget her. Something terrible must have happened. Every traveller who appeared in the distance made her heart beat faster. But each time her hope faded again. The princess remained by the mill and continued to wait, feeling her anxiety grow heavier with every hour. Another day passed, and by evening, the princess ceased deceiving herself with the hope of his swift return. She understood that he would not come that day either. Of course, she could have gone to the castle gates, announced her name, demanded a meeting, cried out about the promise given to her, and asserted her rights. But the very thought was unbearable. She had come to this land as a future queen, not as a petitioner forced to beg for love. The princess decided to remain nearby. She would wait, observe, and hope. But she would surrender her dignity to no one. That evening, she entered the home of the old miller who had given her shelter the night before. "I need work," she said without giving her name. "Please let me stay and help you." Thus the princess chose not humiliation at the castle gates, but patience and honest labour. The old miller and his wife immediately noticed the stranger's quiet dignity and hidden sorrow. They asked no needless questions, and gladly let her remain with them. Thus began her new life, quiet, simple, and entirely unlike life in a palace. In the mornings, the princess listened as the water steadily turned the heavy mill wheel, as the millstones creaked and the flour rustled softly. She washed smooth wooden tubs fragrant with fresh timber, swept the floor, and soon learned to bake hot bread for the workers. Warm flour settled upon her palms. The dough slowly rose beside the oven, and the house filled with a familiar, comforting aroma. Her days were now measured not by the chime of palace clocks, but by the steady murmur of the mill. Every evening, she stepped onto the porch and gazed for a long time at the distant lights of the castle. She did not weep. She simply waited. An entire year passed. Life at the mill flowed calmly and evenly, until one morning, the ringing voice of a royal herald broke the village stillness. In the square, it was announced that the prince had finally chosen a bride. At the Dowager Queen's insistence, he was to marry a wealthy and noble duchess from a neighbouring country. 3 days of wedding feasts had been appointed at the palace, and the first guests were to arrive in only a few days. The princess listened as though the ground were slowly slipping away beneath her feet. For an entire year, she had waited patiently, hoping his memory would bring him back to her of its own accord. Now she could wait no longer. She understood that she had one last chance to remind the prince of the past and awaken what sorcery had taken from him. News of the wedding became not the end of her hope, but a call to one final struggle. On the day of the first wedding feast, the princess locked herself in her little room at the mill and took out the carved box she had guarded for so long. The same 3 ordinary walnuts still lay within it. She took the first, carefully cracked its shell, and froze. Instead of a kernel, there was a tiny rolled-up dress inside. The moment the princess touched it, it unfolded and began to shine with a gentle golden light. It seemed to have been woven from the first rays of the morning sun. The little room immediately grew bright, as though dawn had risen within it. That evening, the princess put on the wondrous garment. The humble miller's helper vanished, and the daughter of a king once again stood before the mirror. She secretly entered the palace and mingled with the guests. No one recognized her. But when the stranger entered the festive hall, conversations fell silent, and the courtiers instinctively parted before her radiance. At the first feast, the prince sat beside his betrothed, but was unusually quiet. When he saw the stranger in the sunlit dress, he suddenly felt a strange unease. Her voice seemed familiar, and her smile stirred the memory of something lost long ago. All evening, he found himself searching for her with his eyes. The next day, the princess cracked the second nut. From the shell fell a dress the color of the full moon, woven from the finest silver threads. That evening, she appeared at the palace again. The prince saw her and seemed to forget everything around him. For an instant, a distant garden flashed before him. He smelled wet roses after rain, saw someone's hands in simple work gloves, and heard his own voice promising never to retreat. He had not yet remembered her, but his heart had already begun to awaken. On the third and final evening, the princess cracked the remaining nut. From its shell unfolded a dress that seemed woven from pure starlight. Thousands of tiny sparks shimmered upon the fabric, and it appeared as though the night sky itself had descended upon her shoulders. When the princess entered the hall, the prince immediately rose from the table and went to meet her himself. This time, she did not wait. Remember, Prince, the old mill where you left the woman who trusted you. Remember the dusty road we restored to life together. Remember the stony field where we worked side by side and understood for the first time that we loved each other. She spoke calmly, without reproach. True love can be erased from memory, but it cannot be torn from the soul. The prince looked at her, and behind her words, forgotten images of the past began to emerge, one after another. Her words seemed to have found the key to a door that had remained locked in the prince's memory for an entire year. He looked at her and suddenly noticed the simple linen ribbon around her wrist. Once, on the night of their departure, he had tied it there himself, so the reins would not chafe her hand. And that was enough. The veil of forgetting began to disappear. Not in a sharp flash, but in a quiet, warm wave. The past returned to him. The old garden and the scent of roses. Heavy stones beneath his hands. The road under the moon. Campfires among the forests. Her laughter, and his promise to return for her at the mill. He remembered everything. The prince spoke her name so quietly, as though afraid of losing her again. There were tears in his eyes, of happiness, pain, and remorse. Memory returned, not only to his mind. It returned to the place where it had always lived, his heart. Having remembered everything, the prince did not turn the wedding feast into a public trial. He merely took the princess by the hand and quietly led her out of the hall. The following morning, the first thing he did was go to the Duchess. He told her the entire truth about the distant southern kingdom, the woman to whom he had given his word, the spell of forgetting, and the memory that had returned only the night before. "Forgive me," said the prince. "I cannot become your husband, because my heart has long belonged to another. To continue with this wedding would mean deceiving both you and myself." The Duchess was silent for a long time, then calmly accepted his decision. Perhaps she herself had never wanted the marriage, thus the betrothal was ended without humiliation or scandal. The prince came to her not with excuses, but with the truth, and in doing so, showed her the greatest respect. After settling every matter at the palace, the prince went neither to the throne room nor to his mother. He went to the old mill. There he saw the princess as she had lived for the past year, in a simple dress, with her sleeves rolled up, among sacks of flour and the warm aroma of fresh bread. She raised her eyes when he entered. The prince approached her and, demanding nothing, sank to one knee in the flour dust. "Forgive me for leaving you to wait alone. I did not wish to forget you, but I know how much pain my forgetting caused you." The princess looked at him for a long time, then smiled and helped him rise. "I was not waiting for your memory," she said quietly. "I was waiting for you, and you came." Thus at the old mill, they found each other for the second time. Later, the prince and princess returned together to her native kingdom. The king met his daughter with mixed feelings. He was happy to see her alive, but could not forget her escape or his own humiliation. Yet the person before him was no longer the girl he was accustomed to protecting and directing. The princess calmly told him of the road where carts traveled once more, of the field that had yielded its first harvest, and of the people who had found work thanks to their shared labor. The king listened and gradually understood that his daughter had not destroyed his plans. She had become capable of building her own. He had expected the return of a disobedient girl, but saw a wise woman prepared to answer for her own choices. Anger gave way to pride. The king embraced his daughter, then offered his hand to the prince, and blessed their union with all his heart. Soon the wedding was celebrated, quiet, bright, and entirely unlike the lavish festivities of the court. At one table sat two kings, the old miller and his wife, the stonecutters, and the farmers with whom the couple had once cleared the fields and restored the road. In time, the two kingdoms united. The prince and princess ruled them wisely, remembering that a land rests not only upon decrees, but also upon the labor of those who live upon it. And their story became a legend. People said that true love is not a magical gift of fate, but a road that two people build together, stone by stone. And if that road is laid with patience, respect, and shared labor, neither another's will, nor distance, nor even a spell of forgetting can destroy it. For the most important roads remain not in memory, but in the heart.